15.
About 32,000 years ago, one of our ancestors carved a series of marks on a bone taken from an eagle's wing. And it's believed that those marks were an attempt to draw, to describe the passage of the phases of the moon, and more importantly, the passage of the moon through the sky. That was quite an achievement for somebody to do at that time. He started something that's gone on for thousands and thousands of years, right through to the present day. 7,000 years ago, somebody made this piece of stone, which is believed to be a lunar calendar. It's found at Newgrange in Ireland. And again, you can see that wiggly line is the path of the moon through the sky, and the other symbols are representations of the moon. And the really sort of spooky thing is that if you whip forward to the 21st century, to NASA, you see the same pattern on the computer screens. That wiggly line is the path of the moon through the heavens. The moon has generated a very rich mythology for us. It's driven us mad, but not in the sense that you might think that I mean. It's possibly responsible for the creation of life. It's possibly responsible for the continuation of life, and it plays a very, very important part in the spiritual, cultural, and scientific life of the planet. And I'd just like to take you for a very quick flip around the moon. One of the most important things to remember about the moon is that it is one of the most entertaining objects in the night sky. It starts like that. It grows to that full moon, and then this is Blue Peter, and then it fades away again, and it does that on a 28-day, 29-day cycle. And I think that cycle must have been very comforting to our ancestors. I think it also must have been very convenient for them, because it's an easy amount of time to remember. You can record it, and you can think about it, and you can say, well, how long ago did that happen? It happened 10 moons ago. How long ago did it happen? It happened 20 moons ago. It's an easy period of time, and I think that rhythm has found its way deep into the human psyche. The moon, it's thought, was created about 5 billion years ago, when a Mars-sized object crashed into the then Earth. In that crash, the two objects fused together. Debris was jetted off around the moon, around the Earth, went into orbit around the moon, around the Earth, cooled, was bombarded by the debris around it, and eventually ended up looking like this, which is our own familiar moon. All the marks on the moon's surface are made at random. The dark areas are just dried lava that's come up through cracks in the crust of the moon. Nevertheless, we being who we are, we've tried to give these marks, which are entirely random, meaning, and we've tried to invent stories to explain why they happen. We've seen frogs, snails, men with sticks, hares, maidens, a load of other things, and I say we've tried to give them reason. An extent to which the moon has driven us mad, for me, is typified by this object, which is a stone that stands at the center of a complex which is about 12 miles wide at Carnac in France. The complex is believed to be a lunar dial that marks the extremes of moonrise and moonset in the summer and the winter. That piece of stone weighs 230 tons, or it did when it was standing upright. It stood 30 meters high, and as I say, stood at the center of something which is 10, 12 miles wide. To build that would be a challenge for modern engineers. To build it without all the paraphernalia of modern engineering was an amazing thing. To collect the data to build it would have taken hundreds of years, and goodness knows how they stored that data, what was going on in their minds. And it's a question that we can ask ourselves when we come to look at another obelisk, which this rocket is, the Apollo rocket, the 20th century space race, where we spent similar amounts of energy, time, money to do something which really didn't do very much for us. It would have been much easier to have sent robots to the moon, and the only thing that robots can't do is they can't handle magic. And I think that's really what was at the heart of the space race. It was an attempt to draw down the magic of the moon, something that our primitive ancestors had been trying to do for thousands and thousands of years. The pilot of the command module of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, described the mission as carrying the fire, a sort of Promethean phrase. And he knew that he was dealing in magic. Magic is dangerous. The first Apollo mission never got off the ground. It blew up on the launch pad, Apollo 1. Even so, the commander of that mission Gus Grissom, had gone on record earlier on as saying, if we die, we want people to accept it. We're in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it'll not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life. That's Gus showing a sort of messianic zeal about what he was doing. But don't get me wrong, it was very, very exciting. And I spent a night watching Apollo 11, the rocket that went to the moon, take off, and I watched it nights later landing, and it was one of the high spots of my teenage life. It sowed the seeds for me to write my little book about the moon. And one of the things that I like to reflect on is just how primitive that mission was. They flew to the moon in the equivalent of a minivan, powered by a tiny computer that had about 2 kilobytes of RAM and 70 kilobytes of what was then, the equivalent of a hard drive. Less power than we need to send an email. But they were very, very cool blokes. And an example, again, of their coolness is that once they'd gone into orbit around the moon, they were decelerating from a speed of 25,000 miles an hour. And as they came in, they developed a problem which was called a 1202. And to hear them talking about the problem and solving it, you'd think that they were ordering hamburgers. And here they are talking about that problem.
Then we had a computer alarm. Computer problem 1202. And, well, what's 1202?
Program alarm. 1202. 1202.
So when the crew reported this alarm, my heart sank, really. Oh, no. We had a main primary computer problem.
1202 alarm. Yeah, the same thing we had.
So the landing radar is feeding information, the rendezvous radar is, and evidently that combination was not anticipated by the guys at MIT. They're pretty narrow-minded. You're making a descent, you need the radar, landing radar. You're making a rendezvous, you need the rendezvous, but you don't need to mix the two. But they didn't think the same way I did.
It's Buzz Aldrin.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
The guidance guy, Steve Bales, responded,
We're going that flight.
I heard him say that to flight control, and I just voiced right up, we go, Eagle, and we were go.
And they were go. And so they're now down to about 3,000 miles an hour. They don't know exactly where they are. They're heading towards a field of boulders which will destroy their craft if they land in the middle of it. And they've got 60 seconds worth of fuel left. And here is that famous last 60 seconds.
60 seconds.
The tension mounted in mission control, and it was like you could feel it. You couldn't see it, but you could sense the tension. And it was, I remember, dead silence.
Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Big shadow. And that's a 30. More forward. More forward, drift into the right level. 30. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ATA at a descent. Mode control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 113 is in. We've had shutdown. We copy you down, Eagle. Okay, everybody, T1, stand by for T1. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Great stuff. But boy, did they have a big carbon footprint. I mean, it cost $150 billion to get there. What did we get for it? Really, we got about 800 pounds of moon rock at a cost of $160 million a pound. I'm not sure that was the right way to spend the money, although I was excited. And they didn't, in the end, draw down the magic. But there is another way to draw down the magic, and that's with... And another thing is that it does give me a bit of a thrill to think that that first thing that I showed you, the eagle's wing, that diagram was scratched on an eagle's wing. The first vehicle to land on the moon was called the Eagle, 35,000 years later. There's another way to draw down the magic of the moon, and that's through the occult magic. And astrology is a very, very important part of the occult. It's the oldest intellectual discipline on the planet. It's been around for about 7,000 years since the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. It died in the Enlightenment, but some of the ideas that the moon and astrology dominated science and the moon dominated astrology, some of the ideas are still around. We all know, don't we, that accident and emergency departments are at their busiest during full moons, and that women menstruate according to a lunar cycle. The fact is that, and the argument for that goes that our bodies are, the moon's medium is water, the moon has power over water, our bodies are 80% water, therefore the moon must have power over us. It doesn't work like that. The tides are part of an open water system, our bodies have a closed water system. We don't have tides flushing around us, swilling around us like they do around the globe. The average menstrual cycle is 28 days, that's absolutely true, but only 38% of women conform to that. Many have longer cycles, up to 40 days, and many have shorter cycles, as short as 20 days, and the chair you're sitting in is exerting a greater influence on you than the moon. There's another myth about the moon, which is that the moon is obviously feminine, Mother Moon. Well, that's not true either. There are many cultures around the globe that have male moons. If we go back to Mesopotamia, the most powerful lunar deity there was the lunar god Sin. In Egypt, the most powerful deity was the lunar god Thoth. Thoth was, in spite of his silly name, was in charge of science, art, and magic. He weighed the hearts of the dead, and if you offended him, he would he'd rip your head, he'd disembowel you. And it's true that Thoth became Artemis, Artemis became Diana, and we all know about Diana. And in case you think that these gods have lost their power, let's just remember for 1 minute the struggle that Salman Rushdie had with the pre-Islamic lunar god Hubal. Hubal had 3 daughters. He persuaded Satan to con the Prophet Muhammad to write in the Quran that those daughters should be worshipped. That's a blasphemy. The verses were called the Satanic Verses. Salman Rushdie wrote a book called the Satanic Verses, and the rest is history. The hand of Hubal tapping Salman on the shoulder through the decades. I'm nearly finished now. The last thing that I want to say in this quick flip round the moon is it is possible that the moon may be responsible for life on Earth. 1 billion years ago, the Earth was a great sort of sphere covered in slime. That slime, it was tidal, and every day it would reveal rock and then cover the rock again, heating and cooling itself. And it's thought that if you do that for long enough, you'll establish a routine called polymerization, the establishment of long chains of molecules. And if you do it for really long enough, and 1 billion years is long enough, it's possible that those chains will become self-replicating. So our own earlier ancestors may be long chains of molecules in the sludge. The other thing is that the Earth wobbles, that's known as its obliquity. The moon damps down the Earth's wobbling. Tiny changes in the Earth's wobbling cause massive climatic changes like the ice ages, and it's possible that because the moon damps down our obliquity and gives us a comparatively stable climate, that's why life in general and civilized life in particular is possible on this Earth, and the moon may be in part responsible for us all being able to sit here in comparative comfort.